Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to part 2 of the Politics and Media Show. Unfortunately, Islamophobia is now well established as a problem for Britain's estimated 2.5 million Muslims. Studies have shown anti-Muslim prejudice has actually grown in recent years. It's manifested in various ways, from attacks in the streets to protests of the English Defence League and even to the negative stories in the British mainstream media. Media ethics are currently under the microscope in the Leveson inquiry, which was set up to investigate media malpractice in the wake of the phone hacking scandal. For Muslims, inaccurate and exaggerated reporting of issues affecting Muslims is another form of malpractice. Well, with me in the studio to discuss this is Richard Pepiat, who earlier this year left the Daily Star for what he regarded as anti-Muslim reporting. He's also given evidence to the Leveson inquiry. Welcome to the show and thank you for coming back. We're also joined by Dr. Peter Morey of East London University, who's the author of Framing Muslims, Stereotyping and Representation After 9/11. Welcome to the show. If we can come back to you first, Richard, we had you on the show straight after you resigned and you sent that famous letter to the editor of the Daily Star at that time, explaining your reasons in quite strong language. What happened to you since? Did your career take a tumble or has it gone from
certainly I won't be working at any of the Desmond publications anymore, would be fair to say. No, certainly I suppose what I've been speaking about, I've continued to speak out about sort of Islamophobia in the media. It's not just the Daily Star, it's not just the Daily Express, it's a problem for many different newspapers, including the Daily Mail, the Sun. And so certainly in that sense, I've limited my options as to where I could work. But you know, it's
I saw an article that you did just last week in the Independent.
I'm doing other articles with people like the Independent and the Guardian. So no, I wouldn't say my career is over, despite I was being told many times you'll never work on Fleet Street again. It hasn't been, and if it had been, that's fine, because it was something I needed to do because I felt it was right, and I was prepared to take the consequences, whatever they may be, really.
Well, for many of our viewers, it's not new news that Muslims are given a hard time in the media, but often people accuse Muslims of being paranoid. So your case is quite unusual. As a journalist, you actually came out, broke the silence and said, yes, actually, I personally have been asked to exaggerate stories which make Muslims look bad. If you can just recap some of those examples for people who may have missed the initial story.
Well, there's too numerous to mention, really. I mean, what led up to my resignation was a series of stories regarding the English Defence League, which seemed very much to be flirting with them and sort of adding credence to their cause. This was juxtaposed with some quite seriously distorted stories about Muslims, including one where it was accused that Muslims refused to stand up and applaud a St George's Cross medal winner. In fact, there had been a couple of Muslims who didn't applaud, but there had been many other Muslims present who had. And this wasn't just the Daily Star reported this. Many other papers did too, and didn't mention that many Muslims had actually applauded. And I thought that was it. By leaving that vital fact out, it was a real purposeful attempt to distort the situation and create an idea that sort of Britishness and Islam are incompatible.
And that famous or infamous story about these toilets, which were supposed to be for Muslim only, paid by the taxpayer.
The Muslim only loos, which were apparently taxpayer funded, despite the fact that they weren't Muslim only. It was one squat toilet in a row of 12, and it was no taxpayer money. It was private money. They could have built toilets on the ceiling of any shape they wanted if that was their choice. Yet again, the Daily Star did know this. They chose to ignore it. I mean, on top of that, I've been asked to go and dress up in a burqa, you know, on the streets. There is a real litany of negative and offensive stories that I was involved in, and I deeply regret that it took me 2 years to sort of stand up and say something about it and quit. But you know, I'm trying to turn that to a positive and use my experiences, sort of doing lectures and things at universities and talks, to try and warn maybe the next generation of journalists.
We'll come back on to what's happening now, and especially your role in the inquiry, and of course whether there are other journalists who are facing the similar predicament that you did. But Peter, you're listening to this. You've authored and researched in this particular area. Is this not really surprising considering what you found?
No, it's not surprising. What's interesting particularly is that Richard tells a story from the inside. What we tend to look at in our book is, in a sense, the end product, and then extrapolate an effect from the end product. But I think it's very interesting to hear about the pressures that practicing journalists come under, not simply to exaggerate existing stories, but in a sense to fabricate stories where no story exists. I'm interested in the pressures around that as well, because obviously there is the pressure to sell newspapers. There's the question of what sells, what kinds of stories sell. But I think it's interesting to think about this in the context of Leveson as well, because obviously there the main driver for the whole inquiry is the phone hacking scandal. But of course what's been exposed along with that, and along with particularly the News International dimension of that, is the slightly cosy, or perhaps more than cosy, relationship between journalists, politicians and the police indeed as well. And so I think one of the things our book looks at are the way those bigger agendas are, shall we say, serviced by certain practices, almost at the work face, if you like, that Richard was forced to, for a while, be part of, which then spread this whole negative image of Muslims, and how hard it is really to dislodge that, because it is
that's one of the frustrations the community faces, because we're constantly told you should be doing more.
Absolutely.
It's your job to put forward the positive face, and yet people say, well, all these things are good, things are happening, but you still only hear about the negatives.
That's right, and it is, I think, to do with agenda. You know, the ideas of framing that we talk about that give the book the title. I mean, originally they come from the sociologist Irving Goffman, taken up then by communications and media experts. And it's really the idea that a story and everything surrounding it, the picture, the context where it sits in the newspaper, and the whole popular discourse above and beyond that, really sets an agenda which can be very narrow. And I think we see that with Muslims. You know, there are a certain number of scary issues around Muslims to do with dress and secrecy and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of the stories that Richard's talking about simply address and replicate those things. They don't really interrogate them, but they're just there to kind of present the same picture over and over again.
Well, interestingly, in our first half, we were talking about football and racism, and we had one of the first black players at international level talk about his experiences of racism, and how now we're seeing, for example, Muslim players being taunted, being accused of being terrorists, being accused of bombers, and how that's changed. And he actually attributed the media influencing people and saying football actually reflects the changes in society, good and bad. And you've been given examples of how certain language, certain images become mainstream.
There is an argument that's been thrown at me many a time, is that people don't believe what they read in newspapers anyway. What are you so worried about? People know there's a bias, so people know to sort of take things with a pinch of salt.
But do they?
And this is from newspaper editors and experts say this. Now, I don't buy into this at all. I accept that people realise that there may be a bias politically in the paper they're reading. However, it does seep into people's consciousness. If you go onto the internet and go onto like far-right forums, they are using stories which are printed in the tabloid press as justification for going on marches and even attacking Muslims. There is numerous examples of I remember the Daily Star. You'd get lots of people calling up when you'd have a really anti-Muslim story and sort of calling up and using racist language down the phone. People believe what they read. And I always thought to myself, if someone only ever read the Daily Star, for example, what would their worldview be like? Would it be balanced and fairly representative of what the real world is? Or would it be very, very distorted and twisted and anxious? And I think that is the responsibility that comes with journalism, and certainly in the context of Leveson, when I go and speak to him, that's something that I'm going to be reminding him of, is that word responsibility is not high enough up the agenda.
In terms of newspaper ethics, especially when trying to sell, because people might say, well, it's just not that interesting to say the world is a safe and cosy place, and here's a balanced perspective.
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, there was a peace rally in Wembley attended by 12,000 Muslims. It got a few paragraphs here and there dotted around the press. But if you look at that compared to when you maybe have a few extremists outside a courtroom shouting death to infidels, it makes the front page.
And you yourself have written about how you used to make calls personally.
Oh, I would call the likes of Ajam Chowdhury and seek out his opinion on Muslim issues, knowing that he's an isolated figure, not representative, but he will make a good headline because he will say something like, I want to ban Easter. I want every woman beneath a burqa.
And so you knew he wasn't represented, because this is again one of the frustrations. Muslims say, why are these people given the oxygen of publicity where all this hard work's going on day in, day out, and people like him who aren't representative get the publicity, which again then increases the fear, suspicion and demonisation.
Well, I'm sure you've seen it, haven't you, in your studies. They make the headlines because they say controversial things, and they become the unofficial spokespeople for the Muslim community in Britain. That's, yet again, not responsible.
And in your opinion, how much is it just about generating controversy, because that's what newspapers need to do to sell, and how much is it some genuine anti-Muslim prejudice at the top, as it were?
Well, I think it's interesting if you put it in the broader historical context of the moment that we're in. It's been said by many people that kinds of racism and demonisation of the other, if we can call it that, always rises higher in times of economic crisis. If you think about the kind of worst types of racism or the most widespread manifestations of racism that Luther was talking about in the first half of the programme, in the 1970s and 80s, at a time of economic pressure, there's always a tendency, I think, to finger the other and to look at people who look different or where there's a kind of solid, avalanche more than a drip really of stories demonising a particular group. Muslims happen to have stolen the limelight in that recently, although of course you had also the demonisation of travellers and so on. So there is a particular...
Of course the Irish community went through it
of course,
in the 70s
and so there is a particular kind of default reaction, I think, within the press and media more generally. This is where I think, again, it's interesting to think about the relationship of this to political discourses and the fact that I'm not suggesting that politicians, mainstream politicians actively encourage this kind of thing, but I think it does also get them off the hook slightly if you're talking about those broader issues such as poverty and inequality, and all those things I think work together really.
Well, if you look at last week where we had the unemployment figures come out, now there's many causes of that high level of unemployment, but on the front page of both the Express and the Mail was immigrants are taking our jobs. Now that's a very sort of strong ideological position to take because there are many reasons, potential reasons why those unemployment figures are high. It suits probably the Conservative, the coalition government to say it's an immigration thing. It's not us personally, our economic policies. But it's probably not necessarily true. It may well be an aspect, but it's certainly not a fair representation of the issue. So I think it serves an ideological purpose to try and blame the powerless.
It's not so accidental. There are ideological and real vested interests.
I certainly think there are. I certainly think that there's an ideological foundation to this.
And you made an interesting point in your resignation letter that whilst a newspaper like the Daily Star claims to speak for the average white working class person, that they only had one report outside of London, even though the readership in the north
and they have no Muslim reporters or black reporters or any ethnic minorities, as far as I can think. And I think that's an issue for the whole media in general. It is a very white middle class profession. And that's not representative of Britain at large. And obviously, people who haven't had experience of living in close proximity to ethnic minorities, or maybe growing up in poverty on council estates, I think that plays into how they become represented in the media landscape. I think that's an issue that the whole media, not just the tabloids, the broadsheets, need to face up to.